There's a silence that belongs only to new parents. It's not a peaceful silence. It's a temporary, fragile truce you've brokered with the tiny, screaming dictator who now runs your life. It's the silence of 3 a.m. when you're lying, perfectly still in your own bed, your body aching with a fatigue so profound it feels like a physical illness, and you're just listening. Listening for the one sound that will shatter that truce. A cry, a whimper, a cough. You're suspended. In a state of high alert, your ears attuned to the slightest disturbance from the room down the hall. For the first few weeks, my husband Tom and I operated on this primal level of anxiety. Our world had shrunk to the 4 walls of our small house, and the epicenter of that world was our son, Leo. Every moment was dedicated to his survival and, by extension, our own. We were drowning, but we were told this was normal. This was Parenthood.The baby monitor was Tom's idea. He called it a technological marvel, our digital guardian. I just called it the box. It was a sleek, white piece of plastic with a high-definition camera and a receiver we kept on my nightstand. On its little screen, I could see Leo's chest rise and fall in the ghostly green and black of the night vision. The box was supposed to give us our freedom back. It was supposed to let us sleep, to let us be in the living room and watch a movie, to let us breathe without the constant, nagging fear that something had happened in the nursery. It was supposed to be our electronic leash, connecting us to our son, but giving us just enough slack to feel human again. And for a while, it was exactly that, a comfort, a reassurance. The soft, static hiss that emanated from it became the background noise of our lives, a constant hum that meant everything was okay. It was the sound of safety. I never could have imagined that the sound of my deepest fears would come from that. Very same speaker it started subtly, as these things so often do. A crackle of static, louder than usual, that would jolt me out of a shallow sleep. I'd grab the receiver, my heart hammering against my ribs, and stare at the tiny screen. But everything would be fine. Leo would be sound asleep in his crib. A perfect little angel, completely still. It's just interference, Tom would mumble, half asleep beside me. Probably picking up a neighbor's garage door opener or something. And I believed him. I had to. The alternative was too much to consider. We lived in a row of new-built suburban houses, all packed so tightly together. Of course, there would be cross signals, radio waves and Wi-Fi signals flying through the air, a chaotic, invisible storm that our little box was caught in. It made perfect sense. Then a week later it happened again, but this time it wasn't just static. It was a sound. A soft, melodic string of notes, like a fragment of a music box lullaby, lasting no more than a few seconds before being consumed by the usual hiss. It was so faint, so brief, that I thought I had dreamt it, but I was awake. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The tune was unfamiliar. We had a small mobile above Leo's crib, a collection of plush, smiling moons and stars that played a gentle rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. This was not that. This was different, slower, more melancholic. The next morning, I mentioned it to Tom over coffee, trying to sound casual, as if it were just a curious little anomaly. He gave me that look, the one that was a mixture of love and gentle concern. The one that made me feel like a fragile, sleep-deprived new mother who couldn't trust her own senses. "Honey, you were probably dreaming," he said, placing his hand over mine. "We're barely getting any sleep. Our brains are playing tricks on us." He was probably right. He was the logical one, the engineer. I was the emotional one, the one running on frayed nerves and hormones. I let it go. But the box wouldn't. The disturbances became more frequent. Not every night, but often enough to create a pattern of dread. I started to hate the silence between the sounds. The hiss of the monitor was no longer comforting. It was menacing. It was the sound of something holding its breath, waiting. The sounds themselves were changing too. Sometimes it was the music box melody. Other times it was a whisper, a low, sibilant whisper, impossible to decipher, like the rustling of dry leaves, but with a cadence that suggested speech. It sounded like a secret being told just out of reach of my hearing. I'd press the receiver to my ear, straining to understand, to catch a single word, but it would always fade away, leaving me with nothing but the frantic beating of my own heart and the image of my sleeping child on the screen. I started doing experiments. I turned off our Wi-Fi router. I unplugged every non-essential electronic device in the house. I sat in the dark, in the suffocating silence, holding the receiver, waiting. The whispers still came. I took the receiver and walked around the house. The signal was strongest in our bedroom, right by the bed. Fainter in the hallway, almost gone in the kitchen. It was localized. It felt personal. Tom's skepticism was hardening into frustration. He saw the dark circles under my eyes, my constant state of agitation. He accused me of being obsessed, of letting my anxiety run wild. It's a $500 baby monitor, Sarah, not a ghost hunting kit, he snapped one evening after I'd spent an hour trying to record the whispering sound on my phone. Maybe we should just get rid of it if it's causing you this much stress. The thought terrified me. Getting rid of it felt like surrendering. It felt like letting whatever it was win. But more than that, it felt like severing my only connection to knowing what was happening in that room. The box was no longer about keeping Leo safe. It was about monitoring the threat. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. I remember it. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that tapped against the window panes like impatient fingers. Leo had been fussy all evening, and it was nearly midnight before he finally fell asleep. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed. Tom was already snoring. Softly beside me, I placed the receiver on the nightstand, its screen glowing with the familiar image of Leo's back rising and falling. I closed my eyes, praying for a few hours of uninterrupted, dreamless sleep. The static hiss was the last thing I heard. Cry from the speaker yanked me from the edge of sleep. I shot up in bed, my body instantly rigid. My first thought was Leo, but as the fog of sleep cleared, I realized something was wrong. The cry was a perfect imitation. A flawless, high-pitched wail that sounded exactly like my son, but it was coming through the speaker with a digital coldness, a slight electronic distortion that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stared at the screen. Leo hadn't moved. He was fast asleep, his little fist tucked under his chin. He was silent, but the crying from the speaker continued, a perfect looped recording of my son's distress. It was a cruel mockery, a performance. My blood ran cold. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver, my fingers hovering over the talk button. I wanted to scream at it, to tell whatever it was to leave us alone. But I was too afraid. Then the crying stopped, abruptly. The sudden silence was more shocking than the sound itself. I held my breath, my ears straining, listening to the low hum of the static. The hiss grew slightly louder, crackling with energy, and then a new sound emerged from the speaker. It was not a whisper. It was not music. It was a voice, clear, deliberate, and close. It sounded like it was speaking directly into the microphone of the camera, just inches from my son's crib. It was a dry, rasping voice, the voice of something ancient and tired, and it spoke one word. My name, Sarah. Time seemed to freeze in that one horrifying moment. The world narrowed to the rasping sound from the plastic speaker and the single spoken word that was my own name. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration of presence. For a few seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was paralyzed by a cold chemical fear. Then instinct took over. I threw back the covers and scrambled out of bed, my feet tangling in the sheets. I didn't grab the receiver. I left it on the nightstand, still whispering its static. I ran down the short hallway to the nursery, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I flung the door open, expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. A figure standing over the crib. A monster clawed from the deepest parts of my imagination. But there was nothing. The room was still and quiet, bathed in the soft orange glow of the teddy bear nightlight. The air was calm. And in his crib, Leo was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He was safe. He was untouched. Stumbled back to our bedroom, my legs shaking so violently I could barely stand. The voice had been so clear, so undeniably real, yet the nursery was empty. I snatched the receiver from the nightstand and stared at the screen, at my sleeping son, then at my husband. I shook Tom's shoulder hard. Tom, wake up. Wake up. He grunted, rolling over. What is it? Is Leo okay? He mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. The monitor, I said, my own voice a frantic whisper. It said my name. It spoke to me. He squinted, trying to focus on my face in the dark. He sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. Sarah, you were dreaming. Please, just come back to sleep. No, I was awake. I heard it. It was a man's voice. It was horrible. I was pleading with him, desperate for him to believe me, to validate the terror that was consuming me. He sat up slightly, rubbing his eyes. Okay, he said, in that placating tone he used when he thought I was being irrational. It was interference. A trucker on a CB radio, a cross signal. That's all. It's impossible for it to be anything else. He laid back down and pulled the covers up, a clear signal that the conversation was over. I stood there in the dark, clutching the cold plastic of the receiver, and I had never felt more alone in my entire life. From that night on, the box was no longer a part of the background. It was the focal point of my existence. I carried the receiver with me everywhere, from the kitchen to the living room, even into the bathroom. I couldn't let it out of my sight or my hearing. Tom thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The exhaustion was a constant fog, but the fear was a sharp, piercing light that cut right through it. The entity, the voice, it grew bolder. It seemed to learn. It started to use Tom's voice. One afternoon, while I was downstairs trying to wash the mountain of baby bottles, I heard it clearly from the receiver on the counter. Sarah, can you come up here? I think he's running a fever. I dropped the sponge and sprinted up the stairs, my mind flashing with images of illness, of hospitals. I burst into the nursery, ready to find Tom leaning over the crib with a worried expression. But the room was empty except for Leo, who was gurgling happily in his crib, perfectly fine. As I stood there, confused, I heard the front door open downstairs. Sarah, I'm home. It was the real Tom, just getting back from work. The voice from the monitor had been a perfect imitation. A cruel, calculated trick to send me into a panic dot. It was then that I knew I was dealing with something intelligent. Something malevolent. This wasn't random noise. This was a targeted campaign of psychological torment. It started whispering things to me, personal things. Things no stranger on a cross radio signal could ever know. While I was folding laundry, I heard it, a low hiss from the receiver. You always hated being left alone in the dark, didn't you? Sarah, I froze, a tiny baby sock clutched in my hand. I thought about my childhood bedroom, about the terrifying shapes the shadows would make on my wall, a fear I'd never even told Tom about. Another time, as I was rocking Leo to sleep, it whispered, "Remember the little bird with the broken wing? You tried to save it. You failed. A memory from when I was 7 years old, a secret sadness I had buried for decades, was suddenly unearthed and thrown back at me by this disembodied voice. It was mining my past, weaponizing my own memories against me. The true horror, however, began when it started talking to my son. I would watch the monitor, my eyes burning from staring at the grainy screen, and I would hear it. The camera would show Leo sleeping silently, but the speaker would carry the sound of that dry, rasping voice whispering directly to him. "Such a pretty baby," it would murmur. "So much better than your mother. Mommy is tired. Mommy doesn't want you." "But I do. I'll always be here." It would sing to him, that same haunting, broken music box lullaby I'd heard before, a tune that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. Every time I would charge into the room, my heart filled with a primal rage. And every time, I would find nothing. Just Leo, sometimes stirring in his sleep as if he were having a bad dream, his little face scrunched in distress. Was he hearing it too? The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any knife dot. My life began to unravel. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping, even when Leo slept. I just sat in the dark, watching and listening. Tom's patience was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine fear for my sanity. Our conversations became arguments. He begged me to see a doctor, to talk to someone about postpartum depression, about psychosis. "This isn't you, Sarah," he yelled one night, his face etched with worry. "You're obsessed, you're paranoid, you're scaring me." He didn't understand. He couldn't. I wasn't the one who was sick. The sickness was in our house. It had come through our technology, and it was now living in the nursery. One night he tried to take it away. "That's it. I'm getting rid of this thing. It's poison." He reached for the receiver on my nightstand, and I reacted without thinking. I lunged, grabbing it and holding it to my chest like a holy relic. "No, you can't," I screamed, backing away from him. The look on his face was one of utter defeat. He saw a stranger in front of him, a wild-eyed woman clutching a piece of plastic, as if her life depended on it. He left the room without another word and slept on the couch. I knew then that I had lost him. I was completely on my own. I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, rocking back and forth, listening to the static. I had to know what it wanted. I had to confront it. With trembling fingers, I pressed the talk button on the receiver for the first time. My voice was hoarse. "What are you? What do you want?" For a long time, there was only silence, the hiss of the static, the sound of my own ragged breathing. I was about to release the button, convinced it was pointless, that it was all in my head after all. Then the crackle came. The voice that answered was not the whisper. It was deeper, colder, and filled with a chilling amusement. It was the voice that had said my name. "I want what is mine," it said. And then it added a sentence that stopped the blood in my veins. "I can touch him, whenever I want." And on the screen, on the little green and black display, I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the nursery, a patch of darkness darker than the rest. And it was moving. It detached itself from the wall, elongating, stretching itself slowly, deliberately, across the floor toward my son's crib. My scream was not a conscious decision. It was a raw, primal sound torn from my lungs as I watched that impossible darkness unspool itself towards my son. I dropped the receiver. It hit the floor with a clatter that was lost in my own cry. I didn't wait for Tom. I didn't think. I was no longer a person. I was an animal defending its young. I launched myself down the hallway, covering the distance to the nursery in 2 frantic strides, and slammed my hand against the light switch. The overhead light flooded the room with a harsh, unforgiving glare, and there was nothing. The shadows snapped back to their corners, becoming ordinary, inanimate shapes cast by the dresser and the rocking chair. The unnatural darkness was gone. The air was still, but the silence was different now. It felt heavy, violated. Leo, startled awake by my scream and the sudden light, began to cry a real, tangible cry of a frightened baby. I rushed to the crib and scooped him into my arms, holding him so tightly he squirmed in protest. I buried my face in his hair, inhaling his scent, reassuring myself that he was real, that he was warm, that he was mine. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hall, and Tom burst into the room, his face a mask of panic. "Sarah, what is it? What happened?" He saw me, wild-eyed and trembling, clutching our screaming child. He scanned the room, looking for an intruder, a fire, anything that could justify the terror in my voice. He found nothing. "Just a normal nursery? What's wrong?" he asked again, his voice softer, but laced with a dawning, dreadful understanding. "The shadow," I gasped, turning to face him. It was on the monitor. It was moving toward the crib. It was going to touch him. Tom stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the last thread of his belief in my sanity finally snap. To him, the scene was obvious. His wife, who hadn't slept in days, who had been obsessed with a faulty baby monitor, was now screaming in the nursery in the middle of the night, terrifying their child for no reason. "Give him to me, Sarah," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He took a step forward, his hands outstretched. "You're not well. You need to rest. Let me take him." A cold wave of clarity washed over me. He wasn't going to help me. He was going to take my son away from me. He thought I was the threat. "No," I said, my voice low and fierce as I clutched Leo tighter. "You don't understand. It's the camera. It's letting it in." I backed away from him, my eyes darting around the room, finally landing on the source of it all. A little white camera, mounted on the wall across from the crib, its tiny lens a single black, unblinking eye. That was the door. And I was going to slam it shut. While Tom was still trying to reason with me, to coax me into handing over our son, I made my move. I sidestepped him, ran to the wall, and ripped the camera from its mounting. The power cord snapped, and the small green light on the device died. I held it in my hand. It felt warm, almost humming with a faint energy. "Sarah, what are you doing? Stop it," Tom shouted, lunging for me. But he was too late. With all the strength I had, I threw the camera down onto the hardwood floor. It shattered with a pathetic crack of plastic. I didn't stop. I stomped on it again and again, grinding the lens and the circuit boards and the white plastic shell into a useless pile of debris under my bare foot. I was panting, my adrenaline singing, a triumphant rage coursing through me. I had done it. I had destroyed it. I had won. For a moment, there was a profound silence. Even Leo stopped crying, as if sensing the sudden shift. Tom stood frozen, staring at the wreckage on the floor, then at me. The house felt empty. The oppressive, watchful feeling that had plagued me for weeks was gone. I let out a shaky breath of relief. It was over. And then the overhead light in the nursery flickered once, twice, and went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only light a pale, sickly moonlight filtering through the window. A power surge?" Tom stammered. But it wasn't a power surge. It was a reply. A low chuckle echoed through the room. It didn't come from the broken pieces of the camera on the floor. It came from all around us. From the corners of the ceiling, from the space under the crib, from the air itself. It was the same dry, rasping voice, no longer filtered through a cheap speaker, but now present, resonant, and impossibly close. Tom heard it too. I saw the color drain from his face, his body go rigid with a fear I knew so well. He finally understood. "Did you really think it was the camera, Sarah?" The voice whispered, a sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was amused. The camera wasn't the cage. It was just a window, my window. You stared into it for so long. You held it open for me. I was paralyzed, my blood turning to ice. I had done the worst possible thing. I hadn't destroyed the link. I had broken the lock. I had smashed the window, and now the thing that had been looking in was finally in the room with us. I don't need it to talk anymore, the voice continued, its tone dropping into something intimate, something possessive. I don't need it to. Watch, I'm here now. Tom let out a strangled gasp and fumbled for the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge, as if held by an immense weight. He was trapped in here with me. With us. I looked down at the child in my arms. Leo was perfectly still, his wide eyes reflecting the sliver of moonlight. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking into the darkest corner of the room. And slowly, a small, knowing smile spread across his face. The voice whispered one last time, no longer from the corners of the room, but from right beside my ear, as if it were leaning over my shoulder, admiring its prize. Now, it said, we can be a family.